So the rise of Africa is inevitable, as His Majesty said. Africa will no longer be the dark and unknown continent, for material and human resources is far beyond measure.
So African Liberation Day, celebrated Sunday, May 25th, 2025, was a big success as expected, and I've been tracking the celebration right across the world, from Africa into the Caribbean, from Ghana to Nigeria to Kenya to Rwanda, like everywhere in Africa, into the Caribbean, from Jamaica to Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, Suriname, and it's been a big success. And I am so excited about the future of Africa as a continent and the Caribbean coming together. Because African Liberation Day, we have been celebrating African Liberation Day for over 60 years. This year is 62 years, because since the inception of the African Liberation Day in 1963, we have been celebrating it now for 62 years, but nothing like this. Nothing like this since the inception in Addis Ababa. And from that time until now, you would have to be like a Pan-Africanist. You'd have to be like someone that is really rooted into the movement in order to follow up what is going on every year. But for this year, with the rise of Ibrahim Traore and people who are never a part of the Pan-African movement and have no idea of what is going on in Africa or in the Caribbean, now everyone came together to celebrate this day. So this is a big deal. And this, to me, this is a good momentum leading into September 7th, when the African Union and the CARICOM heads of government will meet in Addis Ababa, the birthplace of the African Liberation Day. So these are excited times ahead for Africa and the Caribbean coming together. And I think this is a big deal, especially for young Africans in Africa and young Africans in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, because the opportunity now for us to come together, like it's nothing like we have ever seen before. Back in the 80s, in the 90s, coming up, we had no idea of what was going on in Africa. Most people in Africa had no idea of what was going on in the Caribbean. We got information through like music, and we got information that was fed to us like by BBC and those networks. And as we know, a lot of those informations were like fake news. A lot of those information was fake news. And even myself, it took until being an adult, like in my 20s, and aligning myself with like people like Mutabaruka, Rastafarian from Jamaica, Cutting Edge, that was on a mission to educate people in Jamaica about the Pan-African movement and what was going on in Africa. And as an adult myself, and a lot of people I know in the Caribbean had no idea of what was going on in Africa, had no idea about development. You know, people just thought that Africa was like, the countries in Africa was like all shacks and all like a shanty town type of thing. The images that we would get from like BBC World News, not until like someone like Mutabaruka would travel to Africa and would come back with images. For me as a young man in my 20s, seeing those images, and I'm like, wow. So this is an exciting time to be alive. And I would say, like, for young people in their 20s, people approaching their 30s, now, because of social media, we have the real-time connection between Africa and the Caribbean. We can see vloggers leaving from the Caribbean, leaving from Africa, where Africans coming to the Caribbean vloggers going to Africa and interacting with people in real time. So it's never been more exciting to be a part of this Pan-African movement. And one of the things that I'm happy to do with this platform is to share the experience that I've gathered over the past 30 odd years, being someone that studied the word of Marcus Garvey for over 30 years now, with my brothers and sisters in Africa and even in the Caribbean, with people that was never really interested in this whole Pan-African movement and the history behind it. And what I realized is that, especially on the internet, when you would see a lot of content coming out of Africa in particular, coming out of places like Ghana, like Kenya, you see a lot of vloggers and you realize the thinking of people in Africa now. And what I've realized is that a lot of Africans, when they look to the Caribbean, they look to Jamaica and they see like Jamaica as the place that the champion behind the African liberation movement. And what must be addressed is that, look, like the African liberation movement, yes, Jamaica can be credited because of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey in 1919, that was his vision. Marcus Garvey was pretty much the whole architect behind the whole African liberation movement, the Black Star Liner, the One United Africa, the African dollar. And Marcus Garvey was the first on record to come up with those ideas. But in terms of Jamaica being credited, no, because this was pretty much a grassroots movement that was led by Marcus Garvey. After the passing of Marcus Garvey, we saw like the Rastafarians champion this movement in music and in their journey to Africa, as a lot of Rastafarian took on the journey to go to Africa to not just to sing music, but to discover and to see what is going on in Africa and to bring back information to the Caribbean. So the African liberation movement was always a grassroots movement. And I believe that Jamaica as a country got credit that the leaders did not work for, the politicians did not work for. There was no politician that I can see in Jamaica that really supported this whole One United Africa liberation movement. You did not see politicians coming out and supporting this. And, this simple reason, America. America is in control, and a lot of the politicians in the Caribbean just had to be careful of what they did because America is the puppet master pulling the strings. And so that is important to know. Like, if you're going to, I believe that the countries that don't get enough credit for what they did for Africa, first, Cuba. Cuba has done more for Africa, for the continent of Africa, than any other country or island in this region. And no one talks about it. When we talk about Angola, Cuba sent military help to Angola to help Angola to be liberated. Now we're talking about Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, before it became Burkina Faso, when Burkina Faso was known as Upper Volta, and Thomas Sankara led the revolution, Cuba was there. But nobody really talk about that and Cuba. So Cuba deserves a lot of credit for its involvement in the African liberation movement. And I don't think people talk about that enough because Cuba is not really known as an African diaspora country per se, like a stronghold as Jamaica and some of the other Caribbean islands. Cuba is more known as a Spanish country, so they have not been credited for that. And another place that people don't really give credit also is Grenada. Maurice Bishop was one of the few heads of government in the Caribbean that stood up for Africa and anything to do with Africa. And I don't see Grenada get a lot of credit. So if I'm going to give any of the leaders in the Caribbean, past leaders, Cuba and Grenada. And in recent times, we see the Prime Minister of Barbados championing this connection to Africa. So this movement, pretty much a grassroots movement from day one. It's been led by the Rastafarian community across the Caribbean, whether it's in Grenada, in Jamaica, in Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname. Suriname is another country that people don't really talk a lot about in terms of this whole African liberation movement and their journey and their contribution also to it. So this is pretty much a grassroots movement, and Rastafarians across the Caribbean would have to take a bulk of the credit, 90% of the credit of this whole liberation movement and this continuing of fighting for like a united Africa, a free Africa, an Africa that is able to control their own resources. The Rastafarians within the Caribbean, I would say, would get a bulk of the flowers. You know, you have to give them their flowers because they have been there from day one. And so, yeah, African Liberation Day was a success. As I said, like you could see images from, just name the country in Africa, you could see images coming out of Africa. You could see images coming out of the Caribbean. So what I want to do is leave you with some image coming out of Grenada. Grenada's celebration of African Liberation Day. And Grenada, to give them credit, Grenada was one of the only places in the Caribbean where a politician was involved, because as I said, this is pretty much mostly a grassroots movement. So like you would never see like the Prime Minister of Jamaica or the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, or most of the Prime Ministers across the Caribbean marching in this movement. But to Grenada's credit, the Minister of Culture was there. The Minister of Culture was there to endorse and to give a speech. So that is a good look. So this is some of the image coming out of Grenada, African Liberation Day.
Grenada joined the rest of the African diaspora in commemorating African Liberation Day with a vibrant display of culture, education and solidarity on Sunday, marking the historic struggles and achievement of African people across the globe. The celebration, held under the theme Reclaiming Our Identity, Strengthening Our Legacy, brought together government officials, cultural groups, students and members of the public for a day of reflection and unity. The event featured drumming, traditional African dance and spoken word performances, exploring the continuing impact of colonization and the importance of reconnecting with African heritage. Minister for Culture, Adrian Thomas, described the observance as a powerful reminder of the need to preserve African identity and history, particularly among younger generation.
Our African roots are not hidden. They are many times worn proudly in the sun like the kente cloth from Ghana. And on this day, we join the global celebration, not just to celebrate, but to agitate, to mobilize, to educate, and to liberate. Brothers and sisters, as the mighty Kwame Nkrumah once said, we face neither east nor west, we face forward. Today, we must face forward. Not timidly, but boldly, shoulder to shoulder with our African brothers and sisters who are, once again, rising to claim what is theirs.
Representative from the Nigerian community in Grenada emphasized the importance of honoring African resistance movement from the fight against slavery to the struggles for independence throughout the continent.
African Liberation Day is not just a commemoration of our past struggles, it is a call for action for the present and a beacon of hope for the future. It reminds us that the journey towards true freedom, freedom from oppression, freedom from systematic poverty and division continues. It urges us to stand together, not only as Africans, but as members of a global family, united by our shared heritage and collective aspirations.